Good afternoon. I hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Kiddushin Daf Ayin Gimel, and we are starting 3 lines from the bottom on Ayin Beis and Beis. The Gemara begins with a machlokes tanoim, Tanu Rabbanon, Ger Nose Mamzeres. If a person converts to Judaism, the halacha is that they are allowed to marry a mamzeres. This is Direi Rabbi Yossi. We'll see soon what this machlokes is about. Rabbi Huda Omer, Ger lo yisa mamzeres, that no, a man who converts to Judaism is not allowed to marry a mamzeres. Says the Gemara, continuing this brisa, Echad ger, Echad eved meshuchrar v'chalal. If you have a ger, or if you have an eved who has been freed, or a chalal, who is a kohen that's born to a relationship that should not have been, and therefore he is a chalal, the child, all of these people are mutarim b'kohenes. All of them are allowed to marry a woman who is a kohen. My time with Rabbi Yossi. Why is it that Rabbi Yossi says that a ger is allowed to marry a mamzeres? So says the Gemara, because chamisha kahalik sive, there are 5 people who are part of what is considered to be a kahal. The word kahal is used 5 times. And let's see how he parses out each of those 5. On the top of Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, the Gemara says, Chad lekohanim, one group of kahal is considered a kohen. V'chad leviim, v'chad Yisraelim, one for each of those groups as well, Leviim and Yisraelim. V'chad mishrei mamzer b'shtuki, one allows a mamzer to marry a shtuki. V'chad mishrei shtuki b'Yisrael, and one is to marry off a shtuki to a Yisrael. So says the Gemara, kahal gerim lo ikrikal. This is obviously a difficult idea to speak about from an emotional front, but it is in fact what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that a ger is not part of kahal, and because the restriction of a mamzer is that they are not allowed to marry into the kahal, therefore a ger is allowed to marry a mamzeres, because a ger is not part of the kahal, and a mamzeres is only restricted in marrying someone from the kahal. So it says the Gemara, kal gerim lo ikri kal. And then Rabbi Yehuda, what would Rabbi Yehuda say in response to that? If in fact it's the case that a mamzeres is only restricted from marrying someone who's part of the kahal, and if in fact of the 5 times that it says kahal, none of them speak about a ger, good to go. Then we understand why it is that a ger can marry a mamzeres. So why does Rabbi Yehuda in the brisa argue with Rabbi Yossi? The Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda, he says, Kohanim v'Levim mechad kahal nafkid. That Kohanim and Levim, they are going to be all included in one version of kahal and not in separate ones. And that leaves over one extra word of kahal, which can then be used for gerim. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, a ger is part of kahal. And once he puts a ger back into the kahal, so what do we end up with? We end up with the fact that a mamzeres is not allowed to marry a ger. So that's what he says. And then Aiser le kahal gerim, there's an extra word for kahal for gerim. Hachanami tre kahalenin, who perhaps maybe Kohanim and Leviim are really 2 different kahals. However, mamzer b'shtuki b'Yisrael mechad kahal nafka. And perhaps the last 2 in the list of 5 that was listed by Rabbi Yossi, those 2 can actually be combined. They are quite similar in what they're doing, which is permitting on the one hand, permitting a mamzer to marry a shtuki, and at the same time allowing a shtuki to marry a Yisrael. So because those are so similar, perhaps the words kahal 4 and 5, as they were used, were actually both number 4. That still avails the 5th word kahal to include a ger in kahal. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda, for a second possible reason, he holds that a ger is not allowed to marry a mamzeres because the ger is in fact part of the kahal. And the continuation of all of these svaras is lo yavo mamzer b'kal Hashem, mamzer vaday hu de lo yavo, ha mamzer safek yavo, b'kal vaday hu de lo yavo, ha b'kal safek yavo, and we would allow for a person to marry in if there was an aspect of safek. Here's another rationale as to why it might be, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that a ger is not allowed to marry a mamzeres. The Gemara says, hachanami trei kaleninu. Perhaps maybe even 4 and 5, the one that allows a mamzer to marry a shtuki and the one that allows a shtuki to marry a regular Yisrael. Perhaps those 2 are also separate. The Taimei de Rabbi Yehuda is mehacha, and he has another marimakom that doesn't allow for a ger to marry a mamzeres. Yeah, that's correct. So what's Rabbi Yehuda's svara? Hakahal chuka achas lachem v'lager hagar. That's based on the pasuk that it speaks over here, where the word is kahal and is used in the same pasuk as ger. So even if you want to tell me that of the 5 times that it says kahal, none of them refer to ger, but we have an association game, is that in a pasuk that speaks about a ger, it also speaks about a kahal. So perhaps that's a good makom for Rabbi Yehuda to indicate that a ger is part of the kahal, and that therefore would be that if in fact the ger is part of the kahal, then a ger is lo yisa mamzeres, like Rabbi Yehuda states in the Brisa. So to this, the Gemara says with the Rabbi Yossi, okay, Rabbi Yossi, you had very nice Mari Makomos. You had your 5 kahals, and you gave out each one to topics to categories that didn't include a ger. But over here, Rabbi Yehuda presents a pasuk that shows that even with your 5 things being allocated elsewhere, that the word kahal is used for other categories and ger is not included. But over here, we see a juxtaposition between a ger and between kahal. So what would Rabbi Yossi say to this? It's a great Mari Makam that Rabbi Yehuda presented. The Gemara responds, Chuka achas hifsi kainyin. The pasuk reads, Hakel chuka achas lachem v'lager hagar hakahal. So the Gemara says that first word is broken up and is no longer considered to be juxtaposed to the word ger, and therefore you cannot learn one from the other. So all of this is the first part of that brisa that we saw on the bottom of Ayin Beis and Beis, that we're not sure exactly whether or not a ger is part of the kahal. If a ger is part of the kahal, then he's not allowed to marry a mamzeres. That's Shitas Rabbi Yehuda. And if a ger is not part of the kahal, then there's no reason why he can't marry a mamzeres. He'd be allowed to marry a mamzeres. That is the Shita of Rabbi Yossi. And the second part of that brisa, where we had said at the second to last line and the last line of Ayin Beis and Beis, we had said echad ger. We had said that a kohenes is allowed to marry a ger. He's allowed to marry an eved who has been meshuchrar, who's been freed, and she's allowed to marry a halal. In all of those cases, mutaren bekohenes. And perhaps, says the Gemara, a third of the way down on Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, mesayeya leila Rav. Perhaps this supports the shita of Rav. D'amar Rav Yehuda amar Rav, lo husaru ksheros linase lepsulim. Women who are ksheros are allowed to marry people with certain men with certain psulim. So says the Gemara, a little bit of a maisa. Darash Reb Zera b'mechoza ger muter b'mamzeres. So Reb Zera was in mechoza and he was giving a shiur, and what he taught was that a ger is allowed to marry a mamzeres. That's shitas Reb Yossi that we started with today, which means by definition that a ger is not part of the kahal. And the Chevra in the Beis Medrash knew what was going on, and all of the Gerim were upset. They were upset that they weren't put in the category of Kahal. So says the Gemara, Ragmuhu kule alma be'esrogaihu. Everybody threw their esrogim at him, at Reb Zera. And the reason they did that is because they were insulted. How dare you tell me that I'm not part of the Kahal? I just changed my religion from outside of Klal Yisrael to inside of Klal Yisrael. Now you're telling me I'm not part of the Kahal? My Rava asked seemingly rhetorically, Mi ika de darish milsa kihai beduchta de shchichi giure. Is there someone who can teach this idea in a place where there are so many gerim? Namely, how can we teach the halacha if it is in fact like Rabbi Yossi? I'm not saying it's easy, but if in fact it's like Rabbi Yossi that a ger is not begeder kahal, how do we teach it in a way that's digestible? Of course, it's difficult to teach things that are difficult. So it says the Gemara, Darash Rava b'mechoza himself. Ger is muter bekohenes. A ger is allowed to marry a kohenes. True story, as we've already seen, and therefore ta'anuhu b'shiroi. All the gerim were thrilled with him. Oh wow! Look at this big kula from Rava, and they threw a bunch of silk garments at him, and in simcha and happiness, they took their shawls and they threw them in his direction. And hadar darishlu, and then he added in the second phrase, which was ger muter b'mamzeres, that a ger is also allowed to marry mamzeres. So he felt that the right way to present this difficult information was to couch it in the positive, to say that a ger is allowed to marry a kohenes, which is exciting for a ger because you're part of the people. But at the same time that you're part of the people, we're going to just detract a little bit of that because there really still is a problem of kahal, and you're not allowed to, and you are allowed therefore to marry a mamzeres. So Amrullah, when Rava presented this in Mechoza, the people pushed back on him. They said, "Afsidata lekamaisa." Your second comment and your first comment don't work. They thought that the psul that makes them not kahal, and therefore what allows them to marry a mamzeres, ruins them from marrying a kohenes as well. So he says that's not true. Amar lahu, ditava lahu, avdi lahu. I did something good for you. I've explained the halacha in a way that's super clear. If you want, you're a ger. If you want, you can marry a kohenes. And if you want to marry a mamzeres, you can. The world is your oyster. You can do whatever you want within the halachic parameters. But the fact that you're allowed to marry a mamzeres, while it's true that it means you're not part of the kahal, it doesn't mean that you're not a Jew. And it doesn't mean that in a generation your children won't be fully Jewish. But as you transition in that first generation of being a ger, according to Rabbi Yossi, that person is considered to not be part of the kahal. And the Hilchasa, halfway down, 2 lines before the wide lines, last line of the wide lines, ger mutter bekohenes mutter bemamzeres. The halacha is like Rava taught in Mechoza, that a ger is allowed to marry a kohenes and a ger is allowed to marry a mamzeres. Mutter bekohenes lo husiru ksheros lehinase lepsulim. When we say that she's mutter bekohenes, that's lo husiru ksheros lehinase lepsulim, as we saw already, that women who are ksheros, they're not warned against marrying people with a psul. And for whatever, to whatever degree a ger has a psul, that psul is not applicable to Jewish women. She's allowed to marry, even as a kohenes, she's allowed to marry a ger. Mutter b'mamzeres Rabbi Yossi, and Rava's second nakuda, that a mutter b'mamzeres, that the fact that a ger can marry mamzeres is because of Rabbi Yossi, that he holds that a mamzeres can be married by a ger because a ger is not part of the kahal. Says the Gemara a little bit more than halfway down, the first of the very long lines, the Gemara says, Elohein shtuki kol shemakir. We had said a number of days ago that a shtuki is where a person knows the father, knows the mother, but not the father. And the mother would be shosek. Oh, is that my Abba? And the mother says, shh, no, you don't know who your father is, because maybe she didn't know who her husband, who the father of the baby was. So the Gemara says, Omar Rava, Davar Torah, really technically speaking, shtuki kosher. Okay, technically speaking, if you have a woman who conceived in a way that she didn't know who the father was, and therefore the child doesn't know who its father is, the halacha is that technically that shtuki is kosher. My taima, because rov ksher metzla umiyut psulim metzla. Most people are kosher for her, and very few people are actually psulim for her. So the azla inhu legaba, if he came to where she lives, so then called the parish meruba parish. And then we follow the general rules of Rov. And because in general, the people who are available to her are not psulim, so therefore the child halachically is assumed to be pasul. And that's where we can apply the principle of kol de parish meruba parish. However, and now we're getting into some of the detailed halachos of ta'aroves. However, things change a little bit. That vi azli, my amris, excuse me. What did you want to say? What did you want to suggest? That perhaps dilma azli legabayhu havale kavua. Maybe you want to say that things are actually not rov and mute. Maybe it's actually 50-50. How can that happen? When do we apply the principle of kol the parish meruba parish? That we basically assume that the man she slept with is from a majority pool and not from a minority pool. That's when the man is not kavua. That's when the man was mobile and came to him. However, if the man lived where he lived and the woman went to the man in a community that was otherwise filled with psulim, then we cannot use the principles of majority there. That's called kavua. And the Gemara continues 4 lines into the wide lines. So maybe it's not rov and miut. Maybe it's 50-50. So says the Gemara, even if you want to say that, doesn't matter, because Torah amra lo yavo mamzer vadai hu de lo yavo ha mamzer safek yavo. It would still be allowed for a shtuki to marry in. Here we're talking about a mamzer, but a shtuki is even less complex. So kol shekain. And bekal vadai hu de lo yavo ha bekal safek yavo. This we see midoraisa, that because there's a huge safek, it's 50-50. Okay, it's not 80-20, but it doesn't matter. 50-50 is still a safek. So therefore, a shtuki, technically speaking, should be allowed to marry into Klal Yisrael midoraisa, but we don't allow it. So why don't we allow it? The Gemara says 3/4 of the way down. Umatam amru shtuki pasul. What's the reason why the Chachamim said that a shtuki should not be able to marry into the Jewish people? Because gzeira shemiyisa chosa me'aviv. Because this guy, let's say his name is Chaim, because Chaim doesn't know who his father is, he also doesn't know if his father had another daughter, and maybe the woman he's marrying is his sister. But because the yichus is very confusing, or just no knowledge, so therefore he can't marry anyone. If that's true, then shtukis lo yisa shema yisa achos aviv. Okay, I can understand why you would want to say that this man might have had more than one child, and therefore Chaim, who is a shtuki, cannot marry into a regular tzibur. Right? That I understand. But we do know, and from other Mari Makomos, it's not presented here cleanly, but we do know that a shtuki is allowed to marry a shtukis. So says the Gemara, Kol ki hani masnu ba'azle. We don't assume that men are going to be involved in znus in this kind of way, where he has a lot of children with a lot of different women, and they don't even know who the father is because they've been with a lot of different men. It's just we don't assume that level of znus. So while it's true that we may have some concerns that perhaps this man impregnated this woman and she had chayim, and then that man settled down and had a family and has a daughter, there we're concerned. But one shtuki to another shtukis, that means we need multiple cases of significant pritzus that we don't assume, and therefore a shtuki is allowed to marry a shtukis. Says the Gemara, fine. Maybe bashtukis lo yisa, shema yisa achos me'aviv. Maybe the daughter of a shtukis he should not marry, because perhaps shema yisa achos me'aviv, because maybe he'll end up marrying a family member. So says the Gemara, ela lo shchicha, hachanami lo shchicha. That case is not common. So too, our case is not common at all. And this is a kasha on the Gemara. The Gemara is saying that's so uncommon. So is a shtuki marrying his sister. So why would you have that? Can't be the rabbinic restriction. You're talking about 1 billion people on earth. 14 million of them are Jewish. 7 million of them are female. The odds of the person you randomly marrying, if a shtuki marries a girl in Klal Yisrael, that it's going to be his sister from his father, it's a statistical. It's not happening. So the Gemara therefore pivots and says, "You're right, Ella. Maila asu b'yuchsin." We just wanted to be very conscientious and cautious with yuchsin, and therefore we restrict the shtuki from marrying into Klal Yisrael. Now the Gemara has a very similar conversation with an asufi, as you may recall. An asufi doesn't know who either of his parents are. The Gemara says, "Va'amar Rava davar Torah asufi kasher." My taima, because eshes ish bebaila tola. My ika. So it says the Gemara, in regards to eshes ish, had it been that she was actually married, the woman who had this child, she would have said that she got pregnant from her husband. So my Micah, what would have been the problem? That would have just been a regular case scenario of a woman having a baby. So obviously she seems to not have been someone who was ever married. And miyut aruso, so miyut shahalach ba'alem lamadin asayam. There's a very small percentage of women who are in the category of arusa, and a very small percentage of people who would have gone out of town and not be able to tend to their baby. And kevan the ika pnuya, because we're now assuming that she must have been single. This case of an asufi must be where she was single. And perhaps because of starvation, there's not enough food to go around, so she would have said, I'm giving up this child for adoption. I'm not taking care of it anymore. Haba palga upalga. Maybe at least here there's a 50-50 risk. Amra, lo yavo mamzer bikal Hashem. That because the pasuk calls him a mamzer proper, mamzer vaday hu de lo yavo, a mamzer suffik yavo, that only if it's a definite mamzer is it going to be the case. And so too over here, bikal vaday hu de lo yavo habikal suffik yavo, and therefore by an asufi as well, it's 50-50. So therefore, mito raisa, we should assume that an asufi is also allowed to marry into Klal Yisrael. The Gemara therefore says 4 lines from the bottom, amatam amru asufi pasal. Why then does the Torah say that not the Torah doesn't have an isser here? Why do the Chachamim say that there's going to be an isser of an asufi marrying into Klal Yisrael for the same concerns? Somebody delivered him, and someone's the father. We just don't know who it is. So perhaps maybe he's going to end up marrying his sister. If the asufi marries into Klal Yisrael, there's a statistical chance that he'll marry his sister. Minute, totally unreasonable statistically, and we'll reject this soon. But the Gemara says that that's possibly the reason why we limit an asufi from marrying into Klal Yisrael. The Gemara then says, if that's true, asufi is lo yisa. Maybe an asufi should not marry an asufis. Shema yisha achoso. Shema yisa achoso ben me'avi ben me'imo. Here we have a bigger concern than we do by a shtuki. At least by a shtuki, we knew who the mother was. By an asufi, we don't know the mother or the father. So therefore, perhaps when the asufi gets married, he's marrying a sister, either a sister from the mother's side or from the father's side. So then the Gemara says, Kol hani shadi ve'azli. This is not a very common scenario that multiple children who are completely on their own, who don't know who their parents are, that they'd be siblings. It's not statistically very likely. So says the Gemara, one last question. Perhaps Bas Asufi lo Yisa, maybe the daughter of an Asufi, he shouldn't marry Shema Yisa Achoso. Another iteration of a similar question. The Gemara says, Ela lo shchiach. That case is very uncommon, and therefore that's not the restriction. And as well, Hachanami here to stam by an Asufi. It can't be the halachic concerns of marrying a sibling. That can't be. So therefore the Gemara says, Hachanami lo shchiach. Therefore by an Asufi, it's also very unlikely that he's going to be marrying a sibling. And if that's true, we're back to square one, which is why did the Chachamim institute a restriction on the Asufi marrying into Klal Yisrael? The fact that he doesn't know his parents doesn't mean that we are as concerned that he's going to be marrying a sibling of whoever his parents actually were, a child, I should say, of whoever his parents actually were. Ella, here too, in regards to an Asufi, really, Maila Asu b'Yuchsi. The halacha is that by Shtuki and by Asufi, Mida Oraisa, they are allowed to marry into Klal Yisrael, because there are less severe cases than mamzer, and if a mamzer is allowed to marry when there's an aspect of safek, then by a shtuki and an asufi, kol shekain, they're allowed to marry when there's an aspect of safek. But the Torah allows it, so why did the Chachamim not allow it? So the Gemara says that it's maila asu b'yuchs, and we wanted to be strict with our yichus. We wanted to make sure that our family trees are super clean, and therefore we don't allow for these marriages. Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna mitza'u mahu. Let's say that a baby who's found without parents, he has a bris. That means that someone took care of him. Then ein bo mishum asufi. That's not a child whose parents are unknown. The parents know. You don't know who it is. But Chaim was taken care of by one of his parents because he has a bris. Mishlate hadmiya. So here the Gemara says that Rashi says they used to wear these contraptions to straighten out their limbs. If you see a baby like that, ein bo mishum asufi. There we see that he's been taken care of. Shayif mishcha, if he has oil rubbed on him, umale kuchla, if there was some type of makeup or salve that was put on him. Rami chumre, other types of things that were put on him. Tali piska, if there was a little piece of paper tied around him. The tali kamia, if he was wearing a kamia. All of these cases show care. They show that there's a primary caregiver somewhere, and therefore ein bo mishum asufi. Ayin gimel amid base, 4 lines down. Tali bedikla, if the baby was hung in some kind of pouch off of a dekel tree, so we have to see if that counts. And the 2 options are not wonderful. If the baby is hung on a tree in a way where a wild animal can access that baby, so that means that the parents have given up. Yesh bo mishum asufi. Therefore, maybe there is no reasonable parent, because who would actually do that? Imla, but if it was placed in a way where an animal could not gain access to the baby, then ein bo mishum asufi. Zeradata smicha lemata. There's a particular tree that was put near the city, and this tree was known to have shedim. So if a baby was put there, yesh bo mishum asufi, that means we're concerned that we don't know who the parents are. V'im lav, and if the tree was not near the city, then ein bo mishum asufi. Bekinishta smichta lamata, if the baby was put in a shul near the city, v'shchichi be'rabim, and there are people there, so the baby will get noticed, then ein bo mishum asufi. V'im lav, and if that's not the case, yesh bo mishum asufi. If it was not put into a shul next to the city, or it was put into a shul where there isn't a lot of people, then we would be concerned about asufi. Amar Ameimar hai pirat sufli, if he was put into a particular basket where fruits were kept, yesh bo mishum asufi, that's considered the parents having given up on the baby. Charifta dinara, put on the ridge by a river, ein bo mishum asufi, because people will see the baby. Pashrei, if the baby was put in like a melted snow, almost like a ditch of sorts, where there's like an overflow of water, yesh bo mishum asufi, that means we don't trust who the parents are for that child. Tzidi Rishus Harabim, if a baby is put on the side of the Rishus Harabim, which is a place which is less dangerous, there's less foot traffic, ein bo mishum asufi, there's an element of care there. Rishus Harabim proper, where there's a lot of foot traffic and vehicles, yesh bo mishum asufi. Amar Rava, a quarter of the way down, the third of the way down on Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, Rava says, v'shnei re'avon, during years of famine, and we don't know where his comment applies yet, that's what we're going to try and work on now. Ein bo mishum asufi. During years of famine, then we're not concerned about the child being an asufi. We assume that there are parents somewhere. Now, hade Rava ahaya, what is Rava connecting his line to? Out of context, it makes no sense. So what is it talking about? When do we have this qualification that without famine times, it would be a problem, but with famine times, it isn't a problem? So the Gemara says, Ilema Rishus Harabim. By Rishus Harabim, we said that it's going to be considered, the baby will be considered an Asufi. So maybe you'll say B'shnei Re'avon that it's different. So it says the Gemara, I did the Shnei Re'avon Kadlale. Just because a family's hungry, that means that the baby's going to be given up and he's going to end up being killed. Ve'ela, if you want to say that it's a Tzidei Rishus Harabim, it can't be Tzidei Rishus Harabim because after all, we just learned that Tzidei Rishus Harabim is Ein Bo Mishum Asufi. We assume that there is a parent around somewhere. Ma'ir Yeshnei Re'avon, Afilu Below Shnei Re'avon. The halacha would be the same one way or the other, whether or not there's Shnei Re'avon. So the Gemara then says, what was Rava's comment talking about, where he adds in the qualification of Shnei Re'avon? Says the Gemara, like Ki Itmar de Rava Aha. Rava must have been talking about the following thing. Amar Yehuda Amar Rebbe Abba Amar Yehuda Bar Zavdi Amar Rab. Kolzman Shebashuk, as long as someone is in the shuk, Imo. If a baby is in a shuk and parents come over to the baby and they say that's our child, the parents are ne'eman. Ne'esav mina shuk, once he's no longer in the shuk in the more public place, ein ne'eman, and I love the parents are not trusted. My time, what's the reason why they're not trusted? Amar Rava hol v'yatza love shema sufi, because once he was in the shuk for long enough and no one took credit for him, no one took ownership over him, so he is by definition an asufi. Amar Rava, here's where things change. Rava says, "V'shnei re'avon." If it were to have been a year of famine, afalpisha nesaf mina shuk, even though it were to be the case that he was nesaf mina shuk, even if he was no longer in the shuk, there avi v'imo ne'emon and alav, and that's where that's where Rava was adding in his qualification. It was in the case of shuk. It wasn't in the case of Rishus Harabim. 2/3 of the way down on Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, the Gemara continues and says as follows: Amar Rav Chizda, shlosha ne'emanim le'altar. There are 3 people who are trusted off the cuff. Eluhain, Asufe, Chaya, Upoteres, Charoseha. And Asufi, we know, we just discussed that case, and we said that when the baby's in the shuk, we trust the parents right away. In the case of Chaya, we don't know. The case of Poteres, Charoseha, we don't know. So let's go through the cases. The first case of Asufi Hada Amran, we said that if a baby was left in a shuk, and while the baby was in the shuk, parents came over and said, oh my gosh, that's our child, those parents have some degree of ne'emanus. What's the case of Chaya? Titania. Chaya, we trust a midwife to say, let's say that a couple has twins. So the first twin, twin boys, let's say the first twin is going to be a bechor. So we trust a Chaya to say that. But that's only shelo yotze chazra. That's only if she didn't leave where she was. Abal yotze chazra ain't a ne'emanus. If she walked out of the room, then she no longer has ne'emanus. But if she delivered the baby and she's standing there, she says, this kid is the bechor. Mark him with a little string on his leg so we know which kid it is. This kid is a bechor. Rabbi Eliezer Omer huchzaka al omda ne'emenes v'im lav eina ne'emenes. If she's standing in her place, then she's trusted, and if she's not, then she's not trusted. Very subtle distinction, because the first Bameh Devar Mamurim that we saw was that if she didn't leave the room. So over here, Rabbi Eliezer is adding things. The Gemara says it's such a subtle distinction. What are you talking about? My Benai, what's the difference between the approach of Yatzis of Chazra and the approach of Huchsaka al Omda? Says the Gemara, 4/5 of the way down, Ika Benaihu Hadar Apa, if she turned away and didn't look. Then according to one, if she turned away and didn't look, then how could she possibly? According to the other, you have to leave the room. So subtle distinctions in the different approaches. Nevertheless, this is case number 2, where we see that a chaya, that a midwife is trusted immediately. Case number 3, poteres chavroseha maihi ditnan. We know in regards to hilchos nida that if a woman gets her period, then she becomes a nida. But what if it were to be the case as follows? Ditnan. This is a Mishnah on Maseches nida. Shalosh nashim shahayu yoshnos yishenos b'mita achas. There were 3 women that were sharing the same bed. They all went to sleep. And in the morning, they saw that there was a collection of dam in front of one of the women that would have made a woman tmeya. So the halacha is kulan tmeos. All of them are deemed to be tamei. However, badka achas min v'nimtzeis tmeya. If one of the 3 women were to then have checked themselves, and then she realized that it was her dam, she could see that there's a remnant, but also makom that she's bleeding, where the dam continues, whatever the case may be. However, she knew is not for today's Gemara. So the Gemara therefore says, Hi tmeya v'chulan tahoros. She is tmeya, and she exempts her friends. That's the case where poteres chavroseh, where we trust a woman on the spot to say, if she says she's a nida, no, it was me, so then she's a nida and her friends are tahoros. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Chizda shebod ka'atzma kshir v'eseh. So when is this true? Only if she checked herself very quickly. Otherwise, it would not be true. Tanu Rabbanan. Yeah, let's learn a little bit. Actually, you know what? We're going to stop right here at Tanu Rabbanan. We'll pick up Emir Hashem tomorrow with Daf Ayin Dalid. Wishing you all a beautiful night.